So let's go ahead. It's 2 minutes past 2. So good morning, dear members of the Bureau and the Advisory Group, your alternates, permanent and ad hoc members, silent observers, other guests. A very warm welcome today to all of those that are following today's discussion online that are not members of the Bureau or the Advisory Group. As we mentioned in our invite and agreed at our previous sessions, the first part of our joint Bureau and Advisory Group meetings of the Committee on World Food Security will be an open public discussion on selected topics that are key to global food security and nutrition on what we are calling the substantive segments of these meetings. Also note that, as we discussed previously, these substantive segments of our meetings are being webcasted live for this time, for the first time, to facilitate the broadest participation possible beyond Rome, in the ground, in all capitals. So before starting the substantive segment, allow me to give you an outline of today's agenda and propose its adoption. So today, for the substantive segment, as you know, we have 2 proposed items. We'll continue looking at the impacts on global food security of the conflict in Ukraine and trying to help on fostering coordinated globally policy responses within our proceedings. And second, we will also be welcoming today a readout of the recent COP15 of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification that was held in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire very recently. Then on the second part of our meeting, the one that is closed and focused on the participation of the members of the Bureau and Advisory Group, we have ahead of us 3 agenda items. We will look at the CFS 50 plenary planning. We will listen to the reporting exercise from the Advisory Group members, and we'll also address workstream and budget updates. So now, and before kicking off the substantive segment, I must ask the members of the Bureau and the Advisory Group if we can adopt this agenda. And I don't see requests from the floor for the floor, so I think we can have the agenda as adopted. And please remember that, as per usual practice, we will be recording this meeting, but it's just for the Secretariat's use only for operational purposes. So let's go straight away into our first agenda item. The impacts on global food security of the conflict in Ukraine. This is the 3rd time we address this issue at these substantive segments. An impact of the conflict in Ukraine that is adding to the pre-existing already dire situation in many communities, countries, and regions as a result of multiple factors of protracted crisis, of the impact of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. What was originally a looming food crisis is already a multi-layered, multi-casual, and severely aggravated food crisis by the conflict and the war in Ukraine. Yesterday, I heard the Secretary General at the spring meeting of the Paris Peace Forum, where I also participated, say that we may see famine in a way that the world hasn't seen in decades, unless we urgently do what it needs to be done. The Secretary General indeed is deploying all the diplomatic efforts for what he called yesterday a package deal, where all parties would agree on having the food and agriculture inputs produced, flowing in the area, flowing to the global markets, and achieving those that need them most. His efforts through the Global Crisis Response Group are ongoing, and I'm really delighted that the Committee on World Food Security is fully engaged. We're also seeing multiple efforts from governments, international fora, international organizations, increasing in many fronts. And during these last weeks, we have seen multiple initiatives being reinforced or launched. The Farm Initiative from the President of the European Union, France, the Global Alliance for Food Security by the G7, the International Financial Institutions Action Plan to address food insecurity, and recently, the Roadmap for the Global Food Security, the Call to Action, that followed the ministerial meeting convened by the United States at the United Nations in New York, followed by the Security Council open debate on conflict and food security. And I'm delighted to have here today with us Ambassador McCain from the United States. Welcome, Ambassador, who will be updating us on the results of these meetings during these last couple of weeks. So for this first part of the substantive segment, allow me to start first inviting to take the floor Ms. Rebeca Grynspan, as you know, Secretary General at UNCTAD, and Maximo Torero, Chief Economist of FAO, who will brief us on the progress of the Global Crisis Response Group. Rebeca, you are leading the task team of the response group on food, energy, and finance, overseeing the work of the three working groups. I'm delighted to welcome you, Rebeca, today. Buenos días, buenas tardes, Rebeca. Please, the floor is yours.
Sorry, Mr. Ambassador Ferrero, Ms. Rebeca Grynspan just received an urgent phone call 2 minutes ago. She will be delayed by 5 minutes. I don't know if it could be rearranged so someone else takes the floor at this moment. We're very sorry for this.
There is no problem at all. I was going to say you are not Rebeca, definitely. It's not a problem. So we'll wait for Rebeca, and in the meantime, I will give the floor to Maximo. Maximo, we all know you very well, Chief Economist in FAO, and now co-leading also the food working group. Maximo, welcome.
No, thank you so much. And I will be brief. I just have some slides that I thought were important to share of some of the information that we have been looking at, which I think, and basically what we are trying to do here is to try to understand the past and the current situation. And I will be very briefly, and I think this complements absolutely with what Rebeca is going to explain, which is more on the present. But first, the photo of today, as all of you know, we have the problem of COVID-19, the economic slowdown turns, the climate variability extremes that we cannot forget because that's something that will affect us, but the conflict and especially the war, which has come to disrupt a situation that we don't need at this point, and how all these have affected the affordability of healthy diets. But underlying this is increases in poverty and inequalities, which is so complex for us today. Now, all of you know this, we presented before. These are the risks that we are looking at very closely. But also, I add to the traditional scheme that we have on the food and agriculture, the macro and the humanitarian, the water stress and climate change, which I think are extremely important to look at them because they can also prolongate the effects of what we are facing today. Now, the past and the present of cereals, which I think is important to understand. And here I am bringing the food crisis of 2007, 2001, 2011, and just try to raise the issue of how concentrated the exports of cereals were at that time. So 5 countries concentrated across the board more than 80% of cereals. And in the case of rice, being paddy or broken was the same level. This is exactly what we are facing today. Of course, we have high concentration. The reason of the problem today is that these 2 countries, Russia and Ukraine, increase significantly the surpluses. And this can be clearly observed in this diagram, where basically you see how the combined change between 1990 and 2019 of the surpluses to be exported. And if you look carefully, you will see that Russia and Ukraine increasing 66 million metric tons, while sadly, Africa and Asia decreased 62 million metric tons. So that makes them to increase the concentration, and therefore the war is affecting 2 key exporting countries, 30% of the cereals of the world, but it's similar to what happened before. So again, it's a structural problem that we need to diversify more our export supplies in the world to be able to have that, and that is linked to the risk that we have in terms of the dependency today of imports from wheat, 50 countries more than 30% and 20 more than 50%. And the stars here show the countries that has been identified as in the Global Food Crisis Report. So red are the countries which are part of the 570 people in famine, IPC phase 5 or above. Orange, the 3 of the 6 countries which are IPC 3 or above. And blue is the 5 of the 7 countries that there is the highest number of internally displaced people. It's important to know that these countries, many of them are part of these countries which are import dependent of wheat of these countries. One point that I also wanted to raise is that the problem in sub-Saharan Africa, this is the food supply kilocalorie per capita per day of wheat in 2019. If you see Sub-Saharan Africa is light green, which means very low use of wheat. The problem there is the food prices, and the food prices increase not only because of wheat. In the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, it's not so relevant. For North Africa, it's absolutely relevant, but also because it's feedstock, and it affects all the commodities related to feedstock. So it's very important to understand where the complexity comes, and that's why it's so important what we are trying to propose, which is the food import financing facility, where basically it's trying to help the food import bill for the most vulnerable countries. Historically, the commodity price wave of the three crises has been correlated between fertilizers, energy, and metals. But the big difference today is the fertilizer problem. No? And again, if you look at the market structure before, this is the market structure before in terms of inputs of fertilizers, you will see that they are also extremely highly concentrated, but they are also concentrated within the countries. Look at, for example, potash, Germany, one company, 100% of the exports in the top four. And the same for DAP and for urea. In the case of NPK, here what we have observed is a change where Russian Federation has taken the lead in terms of exports of N, the third in P and the second in K, which is what is creating the big challenge in terms of access to fertilizers today, which is one of the major problems that could be affecting the supply of next year. And the big change is because before we were worried more about feed, food, and biofuels. Today we are also linking to the energy market because of this substantial increase in the gas prices, which will affect fertilizer prices and therefore high food prices. So there is one more market that is linking, and that's why working on energy, as is being done by, I will show by Rebeca, is so important. And this shows how historically the relationship was very smooth, and now it's increasing in the last years, which is a problem to look at. And finally, and this of course affects the affordability of fertilizers, as we were explaining before. And finally, the last point is on the trade issue. Here we have the trade export restrictions during COVID. Initially a spike, then it's immediately smoothed out. The yellow line shows the food crisis, spiked, and then smoothed out. And today, what we are observing with the Ukraine crisis, which has increased, and that's something that we need to pay a lot of attention, because this could exacerbate the situation in the future. And why it's so important? Because if we look at the supplies that are needed for the 9 food groups to have access to the healthy diets, Sub-Saharan Africa requires, because they don't have the capacity to produce what they need in those 9 food groups, they require trade. So if we don't have the flow of trade, and also South Asia, we will be facing significant challenges. So I stop there, and those were only the long-term, short-term points I wanted to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Maximo, for this update on all this far more granular analysis of what is happening and taking place today. So without further delay, Rebeca, now I see you on the screen. You are Rebeca, not your ambassador that was before. So please, Rebeca, the floor is yours. You are seeing the whole picture of the task team of the global crisis on food, fuel, and financing. So I'm really delighted to have you here today, Rebeca. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gabriel, and really thank you for this kind invitation. And this cannot be more important than because of what we are going through today. And I want to acknowledge, first of all, the presence here of David Nabarro. David, hello. David is the co-lead person in the food work stream that the Secretary General put together. You know that he created this structure where there are 3 work streams, and is food, energy, and finance. And David has done a wonderful job in the food work stream. So I will give him the floor after I will try to put together the narrative that we are pushing forward and what are the main messages. And I want also to thank Maximo, yes, because we all rely on Maximo for the stats, for the analysis, and he has recently also joined David and Inger in the work stream on food. So Maximo, really thank you very much. Okay, so let me start by saying that when we started this work with the Secretary General, is because we saw that everybody was talking about the war in Ukraine, and let's say, the enormous suffering that is happening there, yes, in every possible dimension and human dimension that we can think. And also, obviously, the countries around, the war. But the impact that this was having in the developing world was being overlooked. And I think that one important thing that the Secretary General did, putting together the crisis, the Global Crisis Response Group, was to draw attention on the impact that this was having in these three dimensions, yes, that is food, energy, and food including fertilizers, yes, energy and finance. And the problem that this represented, because of the interrelated nature that the climate change crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and now the war in Ukraine is having on the developing world and the vulnerable people in the developing world. So we demonstrated in our first brief that this was a more general crisis than was thought at the beginning. And we demonstrated that around 100 countries in the world were exposed, severely exposed, to one of the dimensions of the crisis, be food, be finance, or be energy. And precisely because of several of the things that Maximo already said in his presentation, we didn't want to talk only about food, because we are clear that the crisis in food will also come through the windows of the other dimensions, yes? When you think about Sri Lanka, you saw that the crisis, the shortages in food and fuel came through the finance dimension because they defaulted on their debt. And that's what triggered the problem on food in Sri Lanka, yes. And that will happen to many countries, yeah. That is not only looking at food, but the interrelation of these three dimensions, because one country that is severely exposed to energy or to finance will experience also probably big problems in the food area if we don't put attention. So that was our first, message in the first brief that we released with the Secretary General. This is more general, this is serious, it's affecting countries in different ways, but it's affecting around 1.6, 1.7 billion people in the world. So we need help. The countries have to put together policies to be able to protect the most vulnerable, but we also in the international community have to send the right messages and push for the right policy actions to help countries navigate this again in additional global crisis. In the brief we are preparing right now, we are trying to move from a narrative only of countries to a narrative of people, yes, people that will be affected. And we put together not only the element of exposure that, as we all know, the net importers of food, the net importers of fuel, those that have high debts, but not only the narrative or the element of exposure, but also the element of the ability to cope. Yes, because, Europe will be exposed, but they have a stronger ability to cope than other developing countries. And that's what we are, this vulnerability, that is the compounding effect of high exposure with weak ability to cope, are the countries that will need more support from all of us. And in that narrative, obviously, in that brief, we talk about the food price index, as Maximo was saying, the energy prices, the fertilizer prices, the maritime transport cost, because let's not forget that the maritime transport costs have more than tripled if you compare today with the pre-COVID, situation. And this is something that has been growing in importance in terms of also the effect of transport on prices. And we are saying that we are alarmed by the configuration of a vicious cycle of all these elements. Yes, you have high prices of energy that go into high prices of transport that go again into high prices of food that go again into higher cost of your food imports that go again into the devaluation and currency problems that many countries are experiencing that again go and push prices higher. And then we have to find a way to break this vicious cycle that, take all the three dimensions in a dynamic that is very perversive. So we flag that problem. Then we go to the vulnerability part, to the capacity to cope. And there we start by reminding everybody, yes, that we get to this crisis in a very weak position of households and countries because of the COVID pandemic. And only to give you two general sense of this, well, you know that growth has been revised downwards. 143 countries were revised downward by the IMF, in terms of growth prospects for 2022. We ourselves have our own projections on that. We know that 3 out of every 5 workers in the world have lower real income today than before the pandemic, especially in the developing countries. Just to understand the weakness in country specifics and also in terms of household. So we go and say, well, this is a people-centered cost of living crisis, precisely because of what you said, Maximo. It's not only that the prices of food are high. Let's think about a country where fuel is very high. And so, and energy, yes? And so families will have to decide what to do first, to skip one meal, to have energy at home or fuel to go to work. That's why we call it a cost of living crisis, because if not only food prices are going up, but other parts of your budget are going up. So a food crisis is also brewing there, in terms of malnutrition, in terms of food insecurity in many of these countries. Just to give you an example, a 10% increase in the prices of food for the 20% poorer in the world means 5% of real of their budget. Yes, 5% of their budget is all the budget that they devote to health. So if food goes up 10%, what do? You skip health. You cannot get sick. So those decisions are starting to happen already at the level of the household. And our third message, and I will stop here to give David the possibility to expand on the food because his team has done this work. But in the fertilizer crunch, I think that Maximo said almost all, but we are very worried about other staples, yes, in the world that needs to use fertilizers for the next harvest. And rice is on our mind and our Zoom, being such an important staple for so many countries. Yes. So again, this is not only a crisis on wheat. This is not only a crisis on the neighboring countries around Ukraine. This is not only a problem of few products. This is a cost of living crisis that affects billions of people in the world and puts them in a very vulnerable situation in terms of food insecurity, people falling back again on poverty. We know the correlation between these elements and social unrest that can even complicate even further the situation, and also the possibility of a domino effect of developing countries defaulting on their debt because of this situation. The increase in interest rates will affect these countries severely also. So in terms of the recommendations, you have seen the first brief. We just go deeper in each of them, and if there is any question or possibility, we can expand on that. But we have to really fight complacency in terms of this crisis. This is serious. This will affect many people and really put the world in a very difficult, unstable path. So David, maybe, I'm sorry to have taken so much time. Let me give the floor to you.
I have 1 minute of remarks to make to supplement the excellent analysis and the cross workstream prescriptions that we've heard from Maximo and Rebeca, and greetings to everybody. The most important thing I want to say is this is a crisis that is affecting millions of people already and will affect more. And it's the poorest people in the world who are suffering the most, especially women, children, indigenous people, people in rural areas who have very small land holdings, laborers, small and medium enterprises, and more. It's a crisis that's going to go on for some time. It had its origins last year and perhaps many years before, and therefore it needs systemic solutions. That means initially the response has to be based around safety nets that protect people. And I'm not here talking about humanitarian responses, which are important, but which are for people whose lives are really at the limits. But we're talking about the hundreds of millions of people who, without support, will not be able to maintain their small holdings and their operations in rural areas. The hundreds of millions of people in urban areas who will not be able to access nutritious food and be able to get their children growing up well and being able to contribute properly to the future. The hundreds of millions of communities that will be wiped out in terms of emptying because there will be no economic basis for staying there. Safety nets that are implemented locally by governments, by civil society, by farmer organizations, by community groups, and properly financed by money that doesn't come as conditional loans, but comes as money that countries absolutely need to respond to situations that are not of their making, but they are experiencing. And this is going to cost money, and it's going to be difficult to prize this money away from countries that have got so many other calls on their resources. But please, let's remember, this needs support for the communities that are most at risk in ways that empower them and give them opportunity to have strength and autonomy and where appropriate, sovereignty for the future. Thank you very much indeed for the chance to share these words and to continue serving on this global crisis response group.
Thank you very much indeed, David and Rebecca. It has been an amazing encapsulating the key messages and the analysis that the Secretary General is taking on what you said. Rebecca, it's a cost of living crisis as well. David, you said that it's affecting millions of people already and the poorest in the world, and that will be staying for some time, and some months, and maybe years. So with this people-centered approach, which is the fundamental pillar of the Committee on World Food Security, putting people at the center and those most affected by food insecurity and deprivations. We will keep going today now on the next with the next speaker. And David, Rebecca, what your analysis and what the recommendations you're saying, you're outlining, David, following up before Maximo's analysis. This is so important and it's so granular already that it deserves a long and calm discussion, a long and calm debate. I hope that the CFS will be providing this space also in the coming weeks and months, and we will go back to that later today during the meeting. So now it's my pleasure to give the floor to the US Ambassador, Cindy McCain, to brief us on the roadmap for global food security, the call to action that resulted from the ministerial meeting chaired by State Secretary Blinken in New York recently, and on the results and discussions of the UN Security Council meeting the US chaired on the 19th of May. Ambassador, thanks so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
My pleasure, and thank you. And good afternoon to everyone. And I want to thank you very much, Chair, for organizing this briefing for the CFS Bureau members today. As you know, on May 18th, leaders from 41 countries and the European Union, WFP, FAO, and UNCTAD gathered in New York to discuss the greatest global food security crisis of our time. At the Global Food Security Ministerial last week, the United States released a roadmap for global food security, call to action, endorsed by 36 nations, which affirms our commitment to act with urgency, at scale, and in concert to respond to the urgent food security and nutrition needs of millions of vulnerable people around the world. We committed to provide immediate life-saving humanitarian assistance. And we've also pledged to invest in long-term strategies that promote resilience, including supporting social protection and safety nets, and building sustainable and inclusive food systems, a commitment that is in line with the objectives of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the objectives of the 2021 UN Food Systems Summit. The roadmap calls on UN member states with available resources to give more financial and in-kind support to humanitarian organizations. It calls on UN members to keep markets open, to avoid export restrictions on food and fertilizer, and to ensure safe maritime transportation in the Black Sea. For UN members who are able, now is the time to increase fertilizer production and promote methods to maximize fertilizer efficiency. Finally, it looks to UN organizations and member states to invest for the long term in food systems resilience, especially for smallholders, and prioritizing innovation and improved market monitoring. These are all activities which the Rome-based agencies have opportunities to lead the response within their mandates and aligning to their expertise and added value. This is a time of almost unprecedented humanitarian need. The United States is committed to the challenge inside Ukraine and for the worst affected developing countries. And more than $5 billion, yes, $5 billion in new funding for global food security allocated just recently. I urge all of you to take a close look at the roadmap and to join us in whatever way you can to reaffirm our commitment to feeding the world's most vulnerable and combating food insecurity everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador, for your statement and for your leadership convening 2 weeks ago in New York at this ministerial level and inviting everyone to take action and providing a proposed roadmap for global food security, where also the international organizations and the Rome-based agencies are very important, an extremely important role to play as well. So thank you, Ambassador McCain, for being here today, and as I said, for your leadership. So now I would like to move to the next or the last point of this first part of the substantive segment, addressing an update on what the Committee on World Food Security will be doing in the coming weeks and months, as some of you have asked me to do, especially on the proposal for having a high-level special event on the food crisis and the responses, and the actions that the CFS could be contributing to the globally coordinated response. Well, you may recall, colleagues, that we held a special Bureau and Advisory Group meeting in April, our last meetings, where the Bureau expressed broad support to organizing an intersessional special event at high level, and rather than convening an extraordinary plenary session, with a focus indeed on fostering global policy responses in a coordinated way, with no negotiated outcome document at this point. Well, following that agreement, I have been working since very closely with the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and with the Food Working Group colleagues, and obviously with FAO, to secure a full alignment with the Global Crisis Response Group and to secure that we avoid any kind of possible duplications, and that this sort of event would add value and have a distinctive role to play in the existing global efforts. So progress at this point is what I would like to report back to you is promising. I am working very closely with the team of the Deputy Secretary General and with Dave Nabarro, Inger Andersen, Rebeca Grynspan, and Maximo and FAO on exploring the options to do this gathering later early summer. I'm also working with the Office of the President of the General Assembly, exploring dates and formats for what it could be a half-day event, most likely in a hybrid format, and with the physical venue possibly being in New York, where the President of the General Assembly and the Secretary General would participate. So I hope to have a date on a venue confirmed in the coming days, and it could be possibly the 12th of July in the afternoon as a tentative preliminary date, but we are still exploring the best options to maximize the impact. Well, the focus of this event would be on the responses, on the solutions, recognizing that it is indeed time to act, but it is urgent to act together. Coordinating the policy responses to the global food crisis could be a proposed focus and title even for this high-level event. It would be convened in full coordination with the Global Crisis Response Group. We would be expecting the participation of UN principals. We would be expecting the participation of high-level representation of countries, and we would aim to serve as a point of encounter of the initiatives that are being proposed in different venues, in different arenas, led by different stakeholders and member states. We would be putting people and those most affected at the center of this event. And we hope that this would be a space also to listen to the voices of civil society, of indigenous peoples and farmers, of workers, as well as the private sector. This is the added value of the Committee on World Food Security. This is the added value of a space where member states gather and speak to each other and deliberate in a way that is closely, hand in hand, close to civil society, private sector, the research community, and the whole of the United Nations system, including the family of the international financial institutions. So in sum, I hope to be proposing a date and a venue in the coming days as soon as this is concrete in this close work we are doing with the Deputy Secretary General's team and the President of the General Assembly. So this is my update from my side. I hope to have more concrete news very briefly. And now, before going to the next part, or the second part of this substantive discussion, which would be focusing on the UNCCD COP15, as we expected, I would like to open the floor for a first round of reactions, if you wish, on what we heard so far, before going to Andrea Meza from the UNCCD, the Deputy of the UNCCD. Andrea, and now we see you on the screen. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for being here today. But before going to the UNCCD, I would like to open the floor if for those of you who wish to comment or react on what we've been hearing so far on the responses to the global food crisis. Thank you. I recognize the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism. Raising your hand. Tai, if I see you well, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Relative. I thank Rebeca, Maximo, and David for your reports. Thank you, David. I cannot stress enough how grateful I am that Indigenous peoples are being considered during these type of conversations. And that was precisely my question. Have we been considering the traditional knowledge, sciences, and technologies of Indigenous peoples towards this crisis? I think that we know the results and where we hold the biggest biodiversity in the world. And I wanted to bring the attention to those traditional sciences that have worked for time immemorial. And what do we have to say about that? Thank you. Home.
Thank you, Tai. This is a direct question posed to you, David. So if you wish to reply, I would be delighted.
Just, of course, that's why one wants to be engaging with Indigenous peoples, not just because we know that they are going to be suffering an awful lot if we don't take their needs right into the center of our responses collectively, but also because Indigenous peoples have so much experience of coping with extreme challenges, like, for example, ways of dealing with shortages of water or extreme of temperature and the like. And so in that deep knowledge of being able to make do with alternative foods and alternative systems, we need to be listening. And frankly, the more we can be being able to benefit from this, the better. The more we can mention it in our products, the better. But most importantly, the more that Indigenous peoples are participating in processes like this as responses to the crisis are considered, the better. I just want to say, Tai, how great it is to be able to connect with you in this way and with others from the CSIPM.
Thank you very
Sir.
much. Thank you, David. Sorry, Tai. I see now Patty Naylor, is that right? From Civil Society Indigenous Peoples Mechanism as well, followed by you and Women.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. We, the CSIPM, want to thank the CFS Chair for his tireless leadership and commitment to develop a robust and democratic response to the existing food crisis. The CFS is exactly the right place for the UN system to seek coordination and convergence of the different international, regional, and national initiatives to respond to this and so many other crises, as well as to agree on normative and policy changes urgently needed, as others have said, in order to address the structural causes of a long-standing, multi-layered, and systemic food crisis. We also thank the CFS Chair for his commitment to especially listen to the demands of the countries and constituencies most affected by the multiple ongoing crises, and to find coordinated multilateral policy responses to them. We also appreciate the UN Secretary General's initiative in establishing a global crisis response group to provide him with broad and well-rounded information and analysis on the multiple ongoing crises, principally from UN system agencies and programs, but also from most affected constituencies. We appreciate his invitation to us, echoed by the CFS Chair, to participate in the food network of this group. We understand that this group is complementary to the CFS, since it is directed inwardly to the UN system, whereas the CFS is an inclusive multilateral body in which member states are the final decision makers. Our engagement in this global crisis response group is based on transparency of information sharing, clear reporting lines, and political accountability to UN decision-making bodies, including the CFS. We hope to be able to clarify soon how our analysis and contributions will be effectively taken up in this GCRG. In our view, the responses, as we've seen from FAO, Bretton Woods institutions, and WTO, WFP, G7, G20, and the Global Food Security Call for Action, which Ambassador McCain just explained, are insufficient and flawed because, first, they focus on increasing large-scale industrial food production, such as maintaining dependence on synthetic fertilizers and chemical inputs. The efficient use of fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, are short-sighted, as they do not address the systemic changes that are needed. And these also maintain the increased large-scale industrial food production also maintains a food security strategy based on dependence on global trade to access just a handful of global crops, as we have seen too. Despite this proven vulnerabilities and failures of this production system and its enormous climate footprint, these initiatives do not take into account and build on the relevant policy outcomes of the CFS over the past decade. And in particular, the demonstrated reality that small-scale producers are responsible for most of the food consumed in the world, which reaches consumers through territorially embedded food systems rather than global food chains. These initiatives are not proposing any policy or normative changes aimed at addressing the structural drivers of the multi-layered global food crisis, particularly on such issues as deregulated trade, trade rules that protect exporters but not importers, global financial markets, speculation on agricultural commodity future prices, increasing inequalities, tax injustice, debt and ecological destruction, nor on the need to invest in building climate resilient food systems based on agroecology. These initiatives fail to draw lessons on why the responses to the previous global food price crises were inadequate to prevent a new crisis, and there are no proposals for monitoring pertinent trends related to food and nutrition security, and preempting and preventing future crises. There is no meaningful participation in the most marginalized and affected constituencies to shape the responses through our autonomous formations and organizations. I would like to mention that another colleague of mine from the CSIPM will have another response shortly. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Patty, from the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanisms. Thank you for your words. And also thank you for engaging with the Global Crisis Response Group of the Secretary General. The CFS is the space that indeed provides a wide opportunity for civil society perspectives to be brought into the global debate. So thank you for making your points, Patty. That is very substantive, and I hope that in the coming weeks and months, through the space of the Committee on World Food Security, those will also be considered. Thank you very much indeed. I will now welcome Jamia from UN Women. It's the first time, your first meeting, if I understand well, where UN Women is joining the Advisory Committee of the Committee on World Food Security. You're more than welcome. Good afternoon, probably in New York. Sorry, good morning in New York. The floor is yours, Jamia. We'll need to be now sharp on the timing for maybe a couple of minutes max. Thank you, Jamia.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for UN Women to be part of the Advisory Council. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ferrero, for inviting us to be part of this. Thank you so much, Rebeca, David, and Maximo. You have called this a crisis of the people, a crisis of the cost of living. And as we have learned from the other pandemics, including COVID-19, that we are seeing different impacts of this crisis on people, especially on women and girls. Other crises we have seen, they have exacerbated inequalities, they have threatened livelihoods of women and girls, and this has had a direct impact on their resilience. We know even in times of peace that women are less food insecure, and this is likely to even worsen with this crisis. So UN Women has carried out a rapid gender analysis of the crisis in Ukraine. We are already starting to see these impacts, women reducing their food intake, suffering an energy crisis. We are working with the Global Crisis Response Group with David, Jennifer, Maximo, and as well as the energy stream to provide this analysis so that it can inform the responses to the crisis. We must continue to collect sex disaggregated data so that we can continue to track the impact of the crisis on women and girls, on indigenous peoples. We must make sure that the responses and actions are gender responsive so that we are not leaving anyone behind. And as UN Women, we will continue to engage with the Global Crisis Response Group, with the CFS, to make sure that this analysis is brought to bear on the responses that the global community, national governments, communities are advancing to address the crisis. Thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure for us to be joining the Advisory Council. Back to you, Ambassador Ferrero.
Thank you very much indeed, UN Women, for being part of the advisory group of the committee. Now we'll turn to the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. Oliver, I see you on the screen, followed by the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism. And now we'll need to ask you, please, for being very concise, maybe just 1 minute or 1 minute and a half. We'll need to move to the next speakers, invited speakers that come from the UNCCD and from the ambassador of Côte d'Ivoire. So please, Oliver, floor is yours for 1 minute and a half.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Yes, I think the current Ukraine-Russian crisis and the global pandemic has already exposed how problematic the current food systems is, that it is not sustainable and the current practices are not sustainable. And I think it's also high time to also take the most out of the situation by promoting more agroecological and sustainable agricultural practices. So it's about time to put that as well into the mix, not only or in addition to the other traditional approaches that we want to make, such as improving fertilizer access, etc. So I just really wanted to make sure that we are not losing sight of that, that aspect of regenerating nature, promoting sustainable agricultural practices. And we're also building on what the UN Food Systems Summit has just come up with in the last year, and about looking for nature positive, climate neutral production systems. So I just wanted to put that into the table just to make sure that we are always considering that as additional options that we should be really pushing for. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for putting also the focus on the longer term implications of the ways in which we're facing out the crisis. Now, Hala, my pleasure giving the floor to you for 1.5 minutes now.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. I'm also, continuing what my colleague was talking about, because, she presented what we think is the flawed and incomplete presentation. And we are, seeing these responses and with their shortcomings. And then we think that the CFS has a pivotal role to play now. First of all, we think that the most affected countries and constituencies, they must be at the center of the CFS high-level intersessional event. Governments and constituencies from food import dependent, low and middle income countries, and from countries with high rate of food insecurity, and those also hosting many refugees, as we've seen on the infographics, they are really related. They should have a leading role in this extraordinary session. We need them to share their analyses and their proposals, and also include them in drafting the conclusions. So far, we don't see that any of the international initiatives have offered them, these countries, constituencies, that space. We really think that a session should start with a discussion about the historical context and the multidimensional nature of the crisis. What kind of crisis it is, how to define it. This is a new layer of a food crisis that's always been there. It's a new layer, but how is it related to earlier crises? And why did it happen? What are the historical and concurrent responsible factors? Before we enter into a discussion of how to solve it or policy recommendations, we need to know the underlying reasons. For many countries, the high and volatile prices of wheat and fertilizers and vegetable oils, they come on top of high levels of public spending on pandemic responses and depressed economies due to the shutdowns. Also, other initiatives which have received international visibilities, the Global Crisis Response Group or the G7, etc., they could report to the session, but we think that the CFS needs to develop its own ideas and agendas and rebalance these inputs by giving specific space for the proposal and initiative of the most affected countries. It's based on its mandate of the CFS to eradicate to adequate food. We propose to focus the discussions on developing a new world food security strategy that's based to promote re-localized food provisioning through supporting agroecology, through supporting diversified food systems and small-scale food producers. This would be a short-term and a long-term intervention. And also focusing on social economies and providing decent work and strengthening local food systems and local and national food sovereignty, learning from the resilience that local food systems have shown in times of the pandemic.
Sorry, also, 20 seconds left. Sorry.
Yes, I have less than 30 seconds. We need to agree on measures to curb speculation and reinforce national and regional strategic food reserves and prioritize the availability of food by limiting the biofuel and feed demands particularly in developing countries and address food price volatility. We need to create a new global trade agenda based on the right to food, right to adequate food and nutrition. And also the CFS would make use of its policy outcomes directly related to food price volatility, social protection, protracted crises, smallholder agriculture, and access to markets, and more generally, the global strategic framework for food security and nutrition. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Hala, for your important input. And you emphasized some of the issues that has already been said, and you're making a very strong call for putting people the most affected at the center, and the countries most affected at the center as well of the high-level event when it takes place, and also putting forward the need for the Committee on World Food Security to move ahead on an agreement around what to do in the coming months and also for the future. So thank you, Hala. We'll try to do our best in working in along these lines. Now, and I think the last speaker before moving to the next part of this substantive segment, I see Germany with your hand up. Germany. Silke, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor, and greetings to everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I want to thank the CFS Chair and the CFS Secretariat for organizing this public substantive segment and broadcasting it on YouTube for the third time in a row at a joint CFS Bureau and Advisory Group meeting. That's a very positive progression, we believe. I also want to thank today's speakers for taking the time and providing us with extremely important information. Thank you very much to all of you. It is true, the impact of the illegal, unprovoked and unjustifiable aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine are felt far beyond Europe. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has disrupted supply chains or put them at serious risk, which has already translated into further rise of global food prices. This hits regions already affected by existing crises particularly hard, many of which are highly dependent on imported grains from Ukraine or Russia. So the pressure on global food systems, which are already facing the increasing impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, other conflicts, and the COVID-19 pandemic, has further intensified. Without an agile and immediate response by the international community, we're facing a global hunger crisis on a massive scale, with the potential to negatively affect the political stability and development of many countries and regions. Germany, in its current capacity as presidency, is leading efforts at the G7 level. For example, the commitment endorsed by foreign ministers. G7 agriculture ministers and G7 ministers of finance addressing the intensified pressure on global food systems, as well as the need to keep free trade flows of agricultural products open and prevent national export restrictions. Particular attention deserves the G7 initiated but reaching out to all interested stakeholders. Global Alliance for Food Security endorsed on May 19th by the G7 development ministers and many bilateral and multilateral stakeholders. This global platform, in a direct dialogue with the most vulnerable countries affected, shall lend support to and leverage existing structures, mechanisms, and initiatives, and is intended to achieve maximum synergy and complementarity in mounting to a short-term response over the next 2 years. This shows G7 leaders, together with like-minded countries, act jointly and swiftly, providing a coordinated response to the unfolding global food security crisis as an act of solidarity in support of those most affected. In this regard, we want to thank the US administration for hosting the ministerial level meeting in New York on May 18th and for the organization of this timely and important session. We also strongly support the UN's role and leadership to respond to the global food crisis, bringing together key UN agencies. We welcome the work of the UN Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance, and looking forward to the second set of recommendations after the first ones shared in April. Let me conclude by saying the worsening global food crisis requires our urgent, coordinated and unified action. CFS must respond and serve its mission according to its mandate. This unique committee provides useful space to make all voices heard as it is well advanced on the practices of multi-stakeholder engagement. Therefore, we much appreciate, Chair, the additional information provided today on the intersessional event. The Bureau agreed to, at its last meeting, to discuss a coordinated policy response on the worsening food crisis. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Germany. Thank you very much, Silke, for your statement. So, with no further requests for the floor, and with apologies to Ambassador Sisse and to Ms. Andrea Meza from the UNCCD, we will now go to our second part of the substantive discussion, which is going or trying to provide to receive an update on what happened at the UNCCD Conference of the Parties 15 that was held in Abidjan so successfully by your government, Ambassador, hosted in your capital. So it's my pleasure to give you first the floor, Ambassador, for providing your input on your update on what happened at the COP15, followed by Andrea Meza. Ambassador, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bon, je sais que je n'ai pas beaucoup de temps, puisque le temps est limité. Je voudrais déjà saluer le fait de m'avoir convié à cette réunion de cet après-midi. C'est vrai, la 15e conférence de la Convention des Nations Unies sur la lutte contre la désertification a eu lieu à Abidjan du 9 au 20 mai de ce mois. Effectivement, comme vous le savez, la désertification touche tous les continents et c'est un problème extrêmement important. Et cette 15e conférence s'est penchée effectivement sur ces questions de changement climatique, désertification, inondation et j'en passe. Les conclusions, naturellement, vous seront livrées. Comme vous le savez, ce genre de choses, les conclusions sont assez volumineuses, donc ce qui fait qu'il est important quand même qu'il y ait une prise de conscience collective de tous les continents par rapport à cette question spécifique. En ce qui concerne pratiquement le continent africain, comme vous le savez, plusieurs projets sont en cours, la question de la muraille verte et le soutien des partenaires techniques et financiers pour l'implémentation pratiquement de ce projet de muraille verte qui date déjà de quelques années. Et j'ose espérer quand même que cette convention ait soulevé un certain nombre de questions qui pourront permettre naturellement à toute la communauté internationale, puisque comme je disais tantôt, la question de la désertification, la sécheresse, les inondations, ce changement climatique qui touche tout le monde est une question universelle. Donc, il faut une prise de conscience. Et en plus de cela, effectivement, elle rentre dans le cadre aussi des objectifs du développement durable, c'est-à-dire les ODD à l'horizon 2030. En marge de cette COP 15, il y a eu une initiative, ce qu'on appelle Abidjan Legacy Programme, c'est-à-dire les chefs d'État et de gouvernement se sont réunis pour effectivement se pencher sur un autre instrument en marge de la COP 15 par rapport à un accélérateur au développement de la transformation de l'agriculture, puisque, vous savez, la question de la désertification dans notre pays crée un gros problème. Parce que, par exemple, je vais prendre un seul exemple, le nord de la Côte d'Ivoire, à 90% désertique, il est difficile de faire des cultures vivrières. Alors, si nous voulons une sécurité alimentaire qui soit un peu plus importante aujourd'hui, il faut déjà commencer à réfléchir à la désertification dans les zones cultivables. Alors, c'est pour cette raison, je pense que les programmes sont en cours avec les différents fonds sur le climat, fonds verts, etc., pour aider nos pays pratiquement à non seulement à faire du reboisement, parce que vous n'êtes pas sans savoir que dans nos pays, il y avait une part importante des forêts qui étaient là, mais malheureusement, ces forêts ont été tellement exploitées qu'aujourd'hui, nous avons la désertification qui avance. Et l'agriculture avec, c'est un problème, donc il faut trouver les moyens pour faire de l'irrigation, la maîtrise d'eau, etc. C'est un gros problème pour les productions vivrières. Pour aller un peu plus vite, cette initiative d'Abidjan, pour conclure, parce que je sais que le temps est limité, évidemment, l'initiative d'Abidjan avec les chefs d'État et de gouvernement attendait pratiquement de la part des partenaires techniques et financiers 1,5 milliard pour pouvoir booster, disons, les initiatives en termes de financement de ce projet-là, qui part de 2022 à 2027. Mais il y a eu un succès puisqu'on a recueilli 2,5 milliards de dollars de promesses au lieu de 1,5 milliard. Et ce programme aura pour objectif, si vous permettez, Monsieur le Président, je lis les titres des objectifs par rapport à l'initiative d'Abidjan. 1. La lutte contre la désertification et la restauration des forêts et des terres dégradées. 2. L'amélioration de la productivité des sols. 3. La résilience des chaînes de valeur actuelles. 4. L'identification des chaînes de valeur dans l'avenir. Et ensuite, nous avons aujourd'hui deux problématiques qui se posent, c'est le financement, du développement et de l'insécurité alimentaire. Tout ça sont liés effectivement à la question de la production et à la question de la sécurité alimentaire et nutritionnelle de notre planète. Donc, ce qui fait que ces initiatives vont booster un peu, pratiquement freiner un peu la désertification, permettre aux différents États membres, permettre aux autres continents, tous les continents qui sont touchés par la désertification, de pouvoir pratiquement implémenter des programmes qui puissent freiner la désertification, qui puissent permettre de produire et ensuite assurer la sécurité alimentaire et nutritionnelle dans notre monde. Donc, Monsieur le Président, pour ne pas m'allonger, j'ai fait, c'est une synthèse de tout ce qui s'est passé à Abidjan et ça a été une très bonne occasion. Je profite de l'occasion pour remercier tout le monde, tous les uns et les autres, tous ceux qui ont pris part à cette conférence, 15e conférence internationale en Côte d'Ivoire, et ça a été un succès et j'ose espérer que la COP 27 qui va se passer prochainement en Égypte soit aussi également ait une grande participation et la participation non seulement du CFS, Monsieur le Président lui-même, et de tous les acteurs, les États membres du CFS. Je vous remercie infiniment, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for being here today and for providing this update of the UNCCD. And I'm most grateful to you for your hospitality and to your country, to your government. I was there in Abidjan during those days, and I felt like at home. So thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. Now, and also apologizing for the delay accumulated. It is my pleasure to give the floor to the UNCCD Deputy, Andrea Meza. Andrea, sorry for being a bit late on the expected schedule. So if you wish, please take the floor. If you can take the floor now.
Thank you.
Yes,
thank you, Gabriel. And it's my pleasure. And first, I would like to really thank the hospitality and everything that has been done by the government of Côte d'Ivoire. It was a very successful COP. And I just, after hearing everything that Rebeca, Maximo, and David, what they were saying about this food crisis, what do this COP bring to the table? And I would like to frame it about the importance of generating resilience, and that the COP at the end had 7,000 participants, this high-level panel, and we managed to generate momentum on how we can generate resilience through land restoration and also taking drought resilience also as a core piece of any strategy. And when we're looking at the facts that we just heard about the importance of guaranteeing water security, food security, at the end, everything is related to land and the way we're managing land. And this COP at the end adopted more than 38 decisions to improve this drought resilience, to reduce land degradation, and to create this enabling environment to scale up land restoration. And I would like to bring this as a great opportunity to continue working together in the framework of what this committee is doing to bring more stakeholders, because there is a big potential. More than 125 countries have committed to land degradation neutrality goals. And at the end, we really need to support these countries to generate the right policies and to do the implementation of these concrete projects in the field. And it's through this, through the implementation of these land degradation neutrality goals, that we can also have a very clear systemic approach. And I think that it was Oliver, the one who was bringing to the table agroecological management practices and other ways that we really need to bring and open the scope and see that it is through this systemic approach that we will be able to work with these vulnerable communities, with these rural communities, to generate this resilience. The other important aspect, and thank you, Gabriel, you were there when we were launching the technical guidance for the implementation of the voluntary guidelines for responsible governance of land tenure. And I will say, how can we continue working together also on these aspects of land tenure? Before the COP, the Global Land Outlook was launched, and there we received important data. Up to 40% of the land globally is degraded right now. And this is an important issue that we must consider. We know that we need this systemic approach because using and seeing the land as this important asset, and also all these strategies for restoration are the ones that will allow us as well to achieve climate goals and biodiversity goals at the same time. So I just want to bring that aspect to the table. During Abidjan, we also had and launched a differentiated impacts, a gender study of the differentiated impacts of land degradation and desertification on women. And again, the numbers are very clear. And it was also a call for action. Here, the First Lady of Abidjan, she was really a leader and managed to bring a lot of people together and with very specific proposals and a call to action. And I will close here just bringing these elements. We have an opportunity for a systemic approach of the 3 Rio Conventions using our land degradation neutrality goals, supporting what the countries have committed. And we identified that countries have already committed to restore 1 billion hectares by 2030. And half of these 1 billion hectares are under the LDN target. So it's about seeing the opportunities, continue working together, also giving a good response to drought preparedness. There is a big call for action. We need to mobilize more resources, but the opportunities are there if we manage to continue working and collaborating together. I will leave it there. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for being here today. And congratulations to the Secretariat of the UNCCD for such a successful COP. And you underscored that the systemic approach to the 3 Rio Conventions also provide integrated solutions in the longer term for the challenges we are facing also within this the crisis we are witnessing on food security. So thanks for pointing at that. And while you were speaking, Andrea, and also Ambassador Cisse, I was going back to this time we spent together in Abidjan, and I was reflecting on the way in which youth and gender equality was so at the core of the responses also to land degradation and to combat desertification, and how integrated are the land degradation neutral targets are with our shared goals on food security and nutrition, on providing sustainable livelihoods and prosperity in rural areas and to rural dwellers and to food producers. I had the privilege, Andrea and Ambassador, to be part of the ministerial segment in Abidjan at the COP. I saw how the dimension of tenure rights was one of the 3 topics of the convention of the COP 15. I saw how the decision taken before at COP 14 in 2018, if I remember well, or 2019, decision 26 put tenure rights and land governance, responsible governance of tenure at the center, one of the core drivers for achieving LDN, land neutral, land desertification neutral world. And I saw how the virtuous circles caused by working together between the 3 conventions, the Committee on World Food Security, providing the global agreement of the voluntary guidelines on responsible tenure on land, forests and fisheries, work together with the new guide developed by FAO, helping countries on their leadership to put them into reality. How all these pieces come together and working across the United Nations system, breaking the silos between entities, ministries, disciplines is the way to go. This was, to me, inspiring in Abidjan. And once again, I thank you so much for being here and providing us firsthand this briefing. So I would now like to open the floor for some questions or interventions before going back to Ambassador Vasiliev from Russia. I apologize. I missed your hand before. on time, and you raised it. If not for this item, I understand that for the previous one. So first, before going to you, Ambassador Vasiliev, I would like to open the floor on this topic, on the desertification and on the COP15 in Abidjan, in case there are some other speakers that would like to intervene, and then we'll go back to you, Ambassador. So the floor is open now, and I hope to be more agile on identifying the requests. If there is some participant that wishes to intervene on the UNCCD outcomes. I know I don't see further. Yes. Sorry. Now I saw almost. I almost missed you, Stineke, your hand. This is the problems with the fully virtual meetings sometimes. Stineke, please go ahead.
Don't worry about this. And I was also quite late raising my hands. I just wanted to flag that in fact, as UN Nutrition, we were present at the UNCCD COP, and one of our colleagues from FAO, basically, based in the region, he intervenes in one of the sessions, highlighting again the importance to shift diets, also in the context of this problematic, in fact. So it's of course important to solve many environmental issues, and including desertification. So just wanted to highlight that we are still supporting, and were present at the COP and made this intervention. Thanks to FAO.
Thank you very much indeed, Stineke. And indeed, we will go back to the to the World Health Assembly very soon. Also, I hope in this format. So then, I don't see further comments and requests from the floor on this item. So once again, I thank Andrea and Ambassador Cisse for being here today. And before closing this public segment, this substantive segment and public discussion, I would like to go back to Ambassador Vasiliev. As I said, sorry, Ambassador, I wasn't quick enough to identify your hand before, I understand, for the previous agenda item. Ambassador Vasiliev, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gabriel, for holding this meeting, and thank you for giving the floor. Well, maybe I was a little bit late with raising my hand, or you didn't notice, but actually my question, it addresses both the previous topic as well as some of the questions that had been raised by the distinguished ambassador from Côte d'Ivoire. And it speaks about the funding. And we understand that the food security is an important issue nowadays, and we see how this situation is degrading day after day. And the most recent event, maybe what we see now in Sri Lanka, was when maybe 20 million of people may also be facing this food insecurity situation. My distinguished colleague, Ambassador McCain, she briefed us on the outcome of the meetings, high-level meetings in New York. And as an outcome of that meeting, $5 billion US were allocated to face food insecurity problems all over the world. We also heard the statement from the FAO that FAO will be ready to jump in order to solve this problem. And I also heard the statement that has been just made by the representative from Germany as a current chair of the G7. Well, now I will give you an arithmetical question. So the budget of the FAO is $3.5 billion US. $5 billion US were allocated during the high-level segment in New York. My partner from Germany, she raised the question about Ukraine and about the food insecurity in Ukraine. So I'm wondering that over the last days, the United States alone allocated $40 billion in arms supply to Ukraine. European countries added another $5 billion in arms supplies to Ukraine. So we have almost $50 billion to the arms supplies in Ukraine. So then we have the figure, 3.5 billion budget of the FAO, which also reflects the budget of all humanitarian programs that are being run by this organization all over the world. And we have $50 billion on arms supplies. What is your answer to the question of addressing the food security? How it shall be addressed? Providing arms, or maybe we shall go for programs, technical assistance, fighting with climate change, fighting with COVID restrictions and other things. So I will be interested to hear the views of the experts who are really interested in addressing the food security issues in the globe. And I thank you for this event.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks. I would like not to go into the way of analyzing different kinds of spending on from the members of the committee, and rather, on the contrary, focus on the responses to the problem of global food security in any case. But thanks for the intervention, as always, Ambassador. So now, if there are no further requests from the floor, then we will be closing this substantive segment of our joint meeting. This is the part that is accessible publicly. I wish to thank all speakers for the briefing, the excellent briefings you provided on the ongoing and critical issues that are impacting so significantly global food security, and also, or both actually, in the short, but also in the medium and long term. I would also like to thank all of those who followed the discussion online. At a certain point, I received one of the messages through the WhatsApp. This is terrible, the way in which we are managing virtual meetings. We have at least 4 sources of information at the same time, sometimes in different chats and different emails, accounts and different ways. But one of those said that we were beyond 200 individuals following up this meeting through the website, through YouTube or through our Zoom platform. This is good news. We are broadening the discussion and the possibility of engagement. And I really thank all of those of you that were following online and that are not part of the Bureau or advisory group. So now, before going into the second part of the Bureau meeting, I would like to advise that we will be stopping now the live streaming so that we can transition to the next item, which is the internal discussion of the Bureau and Advisory Group meeting. I would like to ask for just a couple of minutes, to recess. I'm struggling today, I must confess, with my own logistics. You have realized maybe that I changed the room in which I was chairing the meeting, and I would like to rearrange a bit the logistics. So I beg for some minutes and a half or 2 minutes so that I can arrange stuff around my office, if you don't mind. So in a couple of minutes, I will be back and we will resume with the the part of the Bureau and Advisory Group meeting. So see you in a couple of minutes. Thank you.